Welcome to Practice Dirty, a podcast that helps women of color explore their inner well-being. I'm your host, Michaela Rose. I'm a mindfulness facilitator, podcaster, writer, and cowgirl. I've come to learn that there's an inward journey that begins at 40. This process of discovery isn't linear, and the work we have to do can be downright dirty. I'm here to help you along the way. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next episode. I am here today with Hatty Lee, who is one of the 3 co-creators of the Indwell Guide. And today we're going to be talking about mental health, self-introspection, inner well-being, and how she and her 3 partners came up with what I think is probably the best guide for mental health and self-discovery available to men and women of color. So, Hattie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you for having me first. But I'm Hattie, and I am a psychotherapist for the last 12, 13 years now, and I have a group practice out in Los Angeles, California. And I am one of the co-creators of 3 to create the Indwell Guide. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Hattie, how did the 3 of you come up with the idea for the book?
Well, first, we were all friends already, and we never knew or thought we would ever do something like this. But if anything, we were just talking on a pretty consistent basis during the pandemic. And I mean, if anyone remembers what that was like, that was crazy. It was really tough for everyone. And I think we were all dealing with mental health stuff, and everyone that we knew were dealing with anxiety, depression, just being socially isolated, feeling alone. And if anything, I think everyone was so unhappy with being at home. But we realized even more so during that time that so many people were not feeling at home within themselves. And so that's kind of what sparks conversations amongst us. Like, okay, there's something here, and I think we might actually have something to offer to the world.
And what was the impact of some of the movements that were starting to happen during the pandemic? Black Lives Matters, the rise in crime against the Asian American community in California. Like, how was that part of the catalyst for the development of this tool?
Yeah, first of all, we were just so overwhelmed, and it was really traumatic, not just what was happening within our communities, but also what we were collectively witnessing things on the news and everything we were reading about happening to real people, and just kind of the ugliness and just the nastiness that was coming out in our humanity. And I think it was, I just saw so many people just in shock and unable to mobilize themselves to do anything about it, right? They were just kind of taking all this information in and just freezing up. And I was like, okay, there's crazy things happening in our world, and at the same time, it was impacting us in crazy ways on the inside. And then we were isolated, right? And so we were like, okay, how do we bridge and create a bridge here and close that gap? How do we help people to help begin to process what's even happening out in our world, but also connect that to people's individual stories and how that's showing up? And so, we were just being affected by all the disturbing things, how can you not see it, right? It was in your face. And it's always been there, but I think during the pandemic, it just kind of came out in full blast, that we can't deny it anymore, And I think it really provided an opportunity to start having some real conversations, not just with other people, but really with ourselves. And I think that's what, the Indwell journey has been about, is starting that conversation with ourselves, one of the most important people. Well, one of the most important conversations that we should be having.
And what did the co-creation process for the book look like?
Oh gosh, it was really, it felt very chaotic at times, because we were doing everything virtually, we weren't there in a room together, brainstorming and all of that. But I think it was a lot of vision casting, a lot of detail planning, and a lot of self introspection about, what is the story that we're trying to tell? What is it that we're trying to share with the world? What is it that we're needing? What are we seeing that people around us are needing? And how can we really, collaborate to provide something that's approachable, that's digestible, because we know that there's thousands and thousands of books out there, right? Like so many self-help books, so many educational books about the brain, so many, breath work, yoga, there's just everything out there, right? And I think what we are hearing from people in our community is like, I know that all of this stuff will help, but I just have no idea where to start. Right? They're always like, where do I begin? It's just so overwhelming. I don't even want to start because I don't want to do it wrong, And so we were thinking, and so that's why I think when we were creating Indwell, we were like, you know what? I think we need to create something that's a step-by-step approach, not because life is so linear and, like the 8 steps will solve all your problems, but because it just makes it so digestible and practical. And so, I think we were asking the questions, especially in my work as a psychotherapist. And then one of my partners she's also a life coach as well as the designer of the book. We were talking about, okay, what are the consistent themes that we're seeing with the people that we're working with? Like, what are the needs that we're seeing? What are the things that, that's related to mental health? That's a gap in our current education system, right? I mean, all our kids, college, we go to K through 12 and then we go to college, we get doctorates. And, I meet with a lot of these folks and they do not know how to take care of their mental health, and I'm like, what's going on here that we have not integrated this into our lives and into our education system?
Why do you feel, I know we're gloves off, we're being very honest in this conversation, but it almost feels like mental health and self-care has a certain level of privilege, and that does go into white wellness culture. So as a psychotherapist, what have you seen, and why do you feel that, men and women of color, whether that's Black, Asian, Indian, or a combination thereof, why has mental health not been at the forefront of some of our of those teachings that we learn as we grow in life?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the most important questions we were having amongst our group was, what did we experience growing up in our community? And first of all, mental health was never a part of the conversation, right? The story is always a story of survival, right? How do we survive? How do we hustle in this capitalist culture to kind of get on top? Or, you know what I mean? Like mental health is like the last thing, that's for people who are crazy. That's for the weak. That's for the people who just are never going to make it in life. I mean, those are the narratives that we've been fed early on. And so, like you said, it felt like it's always something that only privileged people get to do. You only get to self-care when you have it all, when you've made it, or when, when you've earned it. But it was never like a prerequisite for being human and for doing the work that I believe we all have to contribute to the world. And so, I'm hearing that same message and same story in a lot of the different people of color communities that I've been just talking with. So, I think you hit on a really important point there.
How do you work with your clients to start to change that idea that mental health is only for the weak? It's a nice to have. It's not a must have. So how do you encourage them to start changing that narrative within their own minds?
I don't really have to do too much convincing because usually when my clients come in, they're in there for a reason, and actually a lot of my clients, they're people of color, and there are a lot of clients who've been living this hustle, striving, and just burnt out life. And they're actually beginning to notice that their bodies are shutting down on them. And they're beginning to realize like, oh, shoot, even though my mind is like wanting to do this, my body is not letting me. And so they're kind of being like confronted with the reality of their humanity. And so I think it's just kind of helping. I do a lot of more like connecting with that. Like, hey, like your body is saying one thing, and your mind is wanting to do this thing that you've been fed all your life about how you're supposed to live in the world. There's a disconnect there. How do we begin to turn and listen to your body communicating something that you actually need? How do we stop denying your needs and beginning to start listening to them one step at a time in small ways? So, usually I'm kind of encouraging my clients to let's just start with something small and doable. We're not going to completely change and flip your life, upside down, but we're just going to start with something small and see what happens. And they're always amazed, like, oh my gosh, I just took a break. I just drank my tea slowly for 5 minutes without looking at my phone. And I just felt my body reset, and I was able to just like be more present.
And I think I felt that as I used, your very tool that we're talking about, the book Indwell, in some of my own slowing and processing, where it's just like, oh my gosh, this is really big and dense, and I would take it piece by piece. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, it's like the day that I explored, page 89, one of my favorites, soul. Who are you? Right. And I instantly, start thinking of Michael Singer and some of the work that he does about, what is our soul? And, how have you seen the effects of just these simple recommendations and these simple things that you help guide people through? How do these simple actions start to build upon one another to bring about, bigger and behavioral change? And then how does it help it sustain over time?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. And, I feel like first the soul, like that's such an ambiguous thing for most people. And I think a lot of people come in and they're like, what's soul? Like, what are you talking about? Right. But I think when we're able to just kind of like, I think the big thing is listen to the body and really help people to connect with like the true self, the authentic self, when there's no pressure, when there's no expectation from society to be a certain way, when people around you are not telling you who they think you should be, or, all of that, right? There is like this true self that's, and we know it's a true self because we're full of peace when we're like embodying our true self, right? And I think so many times there's so many just societal things that get in the way of embodying that. And I think when we help, when people actually like listen to that voice, and usually it's very quiet, and it usually only comes when we're, like slowing down and just like intentionally resting and things like that. I noticed that people will start feeling really alive, just starting to like listen to that, and I think that is motivation for people. And when you taste that once, like you keep on wanting to do more of that, it gets addicting.
And as people start to kind of feel safe within that and experience that peace, again, something so simple, but it takes a while to achieve. What has been the arc of that as a discovery and to become an embodied practice in their daily lives? Like how long does it take?
I think that's why the Indwell guide has been split up into 8 steps, because it's a practice. And it's something we do consistently. And I think a lot of time people will say in the beginning, like, oh, I don't know if I'm feeling the effects of it, or I don't know if it's helping yet, And so I think the practice of creating these habits, and the 8 steps, they're basically habits and they're practices that we can incorporate into their lives. And the more we do them and the more frequent we do them, I think for some people, they'll see like change within a couple of days, some people weeks, some people months, right? But it just kind of depends, I think, the severity of how much we're needing to rewire in the brain, because the brain is so used to like living a certain way that to integrate these practices, it takes a lot of intentional effort, right? A lot of like redirecting. from that old way to this new way. And so, yeah, I've seen it really different for everybody. And so it just kind of, I think that's why it's a very individualized process. But I do see that with every person that I have ever worked with, these are some very consistent practices that are part of their lives when they are feeling well. Like it's always there in the
What have been some of the successes with the 8 steps that you've heard about from whether there's a client of yours or another practitioner who's used it in her work, such as myself?
Yeah. I mean, I think I will, people, this isn't meant to like you do like all 8 steps one day, right? I mean, you could.
Right.
But I think what's been really just revelatory for people is, like, for example, step 1 is grounding your nervous system, right? And the reason why step 1 is grounding your nervous system is if you were to try to do step 2, which is being present and being attuned to your environment and inside, if your nervous system is dysregulated, you actually can't be present. Like there's no way you could do step 2 unless you have step 1 down. Right. But so many times I have clients coming in and they're trying to go into analysis and, like get into their like trauma, they're trying to like explore and connect the dots and do all this stuff. But during the session, they're completely dysregulated. And even though we might make that connection or be able to pay attention, it does nothing for us unless we're able to have a grounded nervous system, right? And so I think a lot of people have been saying like, oh gosh, I didn't realize that, right? Even a lot of therapists have been telling me like, gosh, I didn't realize sometimes my clients are like talking about these very insightful things, but they're just going in circles and ruminating over them and it's not doing anything for them, right? They have the insight, but they can't. Like it doesn't like move them into like change, right? Or change behavior, but it's because their nervous system is dysregulated, right? So I think it's been really helping people to think a little differently about our bodies and how to relate with it, right? That it's not just like do any random step, because I think even in our just our culture, people are saying, oh, like, self-care or like do this, do that, or you know what I mean? There's all this like information. And people think, oh, if I just do a random thing, yeah, it should help. But if you're dysregulated, sometimes we could be doing something good with a dysregulated nervous system, and it could actually be very damaging. It's like like exercise, right? Like exercise is wonderful, but sometimes when we're dysregulated, we'll do it like so much to the point that we'll actually hurt our bodies because we're like not listening to our bodies, or we're just trying to cope or escape, right? So there's a lot of nuance there.
When someone first starts on their journey, how do you advise them to start to regulate their nervous system and to ground? I
usually start with breath work, right? Because it's something we all do already. And I don't think I actually learned this until much later in my clinical work, which is that, the way we breathe can actually affect how we feel. Right?
Yes.
And, at birth, and when I watch my kids, I see that they actually know how to breathe optimally, which is you breathe in through your nose and your belly rises, right? And then you exhale, releasing all of that out of your body through your mouth usually, right? But when we get older, we actually do a lot of short breaths or we just breathe in through our nose. And so we're not really releasing a lot of the air that we've just breathed in. And that's actually one of the signs of a dysregulated nervous system. So for a lot of us, and I didn't know this until I started working on my breath, like I was chronically letting myself be dysregulated by the way I was breathing.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh my gosh, like this has been life-changing. Like I'm not giving the oxygen that my body needs in an optimal way. And so my body is not able to function and do what it's supposed to do, which is it knows how to regulate itself, And so I usually do a lot of deep breathing. And you probably are much more experienced in some of the more special, different types of breath work than I am. Because I know there's so many ways, right? So many different methods and all of that. But yeah, I would say that's like a very important thing. Another thing is movement, right? I mean, I didn't know this until much later, but there's actually more information that's getting sent from our body to our brain than our brain to our bodies. And that was like mind blowing to me because so much of our society and so much of what we learn is, oh, change your mind, right? It's always about change your mind and then like move, right? Or do whatever. But the science is actually telling us that no, a majority of the communication happens from the body to the brain. So that's why even the way we move our bodies can affect our brain and how we feel. And so that's why movement is really powerful, and the way you move. I talk a little bit about this very briefly in the book as well, about bilateral movement, right? Which is where you move in a rhythmic right left pattern, and what that does is it stimulates both parts of your brain, and it actually helps your brain work better and process things better. And so that's something, any kind of movement really can be extremely regulating on the body. So that's just a few things, but there's a whole bunch. I know you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And how, one of the central themes in the guide, and with all these the journal prompts, the introspection that you encourage people to do, is about feeling at home within themselves.
Yeah.
So many people think their happiness or fulfillment comes from external things.
Right.
But really, we've learned, and there's science to prove it, it's like it's about being at home within yourself. What does it take to kind of help someone realize that fact?
Yeah. I mean, this idea of being at home within ourselves, it came out during the pandemic because everyone was so unhappy being at home.
Right, their physical homes. Yeah.
And I felt like there was like this parallel, right, with what was happening in our physical world with what was happening in our internal world. And so, we did this play off of this idea of being at home within ourselves and thinking about like, even physically, right? How do we feel at home in our physical environment, right? We create safety. We put some of our favorite things, we maybe we have keepsakes. We have things that, remind us of like our favorite memories. We have photos. We have, maybe our favorite furnitures, or we have like things that like bring joy, that we have artwork, like, we have all these physical things. And I was thinking about like, what about our emotion, our inner home, right? Like, what do we have in there that actually, like, what would make us feel at home inside our home, and I think, I don't feel like, so that just really kind of gave us a base for like how to flesh this out, right? How do we start building our home from within? How do we, what are some of the stories? What are the messages? What are the kind of memories that we need to really savor to feel at home within ourselves? What are some of who are the people, right? That like when we, that are in our hearts that make us feel at home? What are the activities that we do that make us feel at home? What are the places, the spaces, like nature, like plants, like whatever it is, right? So we kind of were thinking of, we kind of had that kind of vision, I think, when we were thinking about being at home within ourselves, right? What are the truths or the messages that we need to like remind ourselves about who we are, that really, help us experience that peace at home? And so, I think the steps help work toward building, or maybe rebuilding or recovering some of those messages and practices and experiences, so that we could feel at home within ourselves.
I love it. And I would love to get your insights on trauma-informed, care. And because, the topic of everything, being trauma informed is really, I think I see that as a huge conversation piece in 2023 because of everything that's happened during the pandemic. Everything from, trauma informed leadership to trauma informed yoga. But so can you kind of maybe break down what trauma-informed practice kind of actually means for someone versus kind of getting beyond the, the trend of using it just as a general term, because it's much deeper than that, especially for people of color.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's really important to understand what trauma is, right?
Yeah.
When I work with clients, people just, everyone comes in, or a lot of, my clients come in, they're like, oh yeah, I have no trauma, like I've never been traumatized. Like, like I had nothing big happen. Like, you know what I mean? I was never in a natural disaster or got in some huge accident. People just have this idea of what trauma is.
Yeah.
So, and then they're like, why am I experiencing so much anxiety? Why am I so depressed? And I think so when we approach trauma-informed care, it's really important to acknowledge that trauma can impact anyone and everyone, right? And it doesn't have to be this like big event or like being at war or, you know what I mean? Like whatever it is for it to be traumatic. Like it really depends on it depends on basically your unique makeup, right? So it could be your genes, right? We know that trauma passes through the genes, which is called epigenetics. Okay. It could also be part of your temperament, right? We know that there's folks who are more, let's say like there's a highly sensitive temperament, right? Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Yes, like HSP, right? And that is literally neurological, right? It's part of who you are, and that can make you more sensitive to the impact of experiences, right? And it's the very reason I think, some of these like differences, why someone could be, like it's like 9/11, right? There's so many people who experienced 9/11, but not every single person was traumatized by it. And I think it's really influenced by people's individuals' history, right? Upbringing, personality, temperament, genes, all of that, and the social support system. And in the book, I do have a section on trauma where I actually explain just what it is.
Yep.
And I think that piece was like really important for me to include in there because I know that people have such a misunderstanding about it. And I talk about it as it's basically when there is too much. It could be anything when there's too much happening too soon without any kind of social support being there to support you, right?
Yep.
There's been research studies on people who've experienced traumatic events, and what they found was that it's not so much as to what happens, right, that makes it traumatic. It's when someone's going through something difficult and their nervous system is completely dysregulated because of it, and they don't have the social support to be able to move through the experience. And so that traumatic, so that can become traumatic because your nervous system, basically, it gets stuck in basically staying dysregulated, right? It doesn't get the resolution that it needs, and so it gets stuck. And so people could, so I think that like understanding that anyone, like it can impact anyone is really important. And then it really, sorry, what was the question again?
Oh, you did just fine. We were talking about better defining, trauma-informed practices versus just the mainstream kind of catchiness that they're starting to achieve. So as we don't lose the meaning and the understanding of what it means.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So, even though people might feel like they didn't experience something that was that bad, right? Just being in our society, it leaves us vulnerable to traumatic experiences, right? And so, I think just really understanding what is your experience and really letting people have power and ownership of their own experiences. And if they feel like what they experienced was traumatic, I mean, we believe them, and we don't get to diagnose other people, So I think it's just very situational and very individual. And so anything could technically be very violating.
And Hattie, as you've when it I was I guess I get to start thinking all these questions as I listen to you speak. So what would you advise like a company in about kind of how to support the mental health of their employees, especially those that are, maybe people of color, and or exploring their identity or all these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think number one is talking about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There being just normalizing conversations around it, where taking mental health days is encouraged and promoted, right?
Yeah.
Where you don't have to like be so like debilitated to take a mental health day, but just encouraging even rest, right? And I think just even not making it so difficult. People need to take time off, right? Like to take time off, right? Just giving people permission to do that, because I think people know their bodies and know themselves, right? Also, even having like a like mental health fund, right? Even helping people make mental health support more accessible, or or I don't know, just even like making it part of their benefits plan, or I think just even the way that a company brands, like even in their branding, right? Making sure like it's the messaging aligned with well-being and mental health, right? And the values that promote mental health. So I think it could go really deep, like, even to the leadership and the structure of the organization. Like, I think you can really see, like, is mental health prioritized here, or is production prioritized, right? Is, you know what I mean? So I think just some of those things could be some good questions that a company can ask themselves if they're doing.
I love it. I love it. So I'm going to bring it back to the book. So in terms of, pursuit of purpose and passion, like what do you often, is there a common theme that you see as people maybe work towards the end of like looking at what matters to them and building a life of matter to themselves versus what society says that sometimes happens as they get to maybe that a more later stage of their journey?
Yeah, I mean, everyone is so different, but I think what's always true is that when people have like connected with themselves in a more authentic way, and they have a very stronger sense of who they are, it's so much easier to know what it is like are their passion, what it is that they're wanting to do, where is they're wanting to go, And so I feel like just what we do, it must flow out of identity and just a strong sense of knowing who we are. And I think that's why the steps have been organized the way it is, where the first, 6 steps is really about like your relationship with yourself, and then it goes on to relations with people. And then there's kind of the purpose piece, of your relationship with your passion and your vision, and then your relationship with your world, right? And I structured it that way because I get a lot of people. I work with a lot of activists. I work with a lot of helpers. I work with a lot of people who are doing amazing things in the world. But it's not surprising to hear a lot of these folks say, like, I have no dream for myself personally. Everything is so much about other people or the world. And so they lose their sense of self even in that process and get burnt out, right? And so I think that's why I think, a lot of times people are like, oh, I want to change the world, right? They'll say something like that. But there's a lot of change that's needing to happen within themselves, and they're needing to reclaim and recover some of their own dreams. Even some things that might feel like, I hear a lot of people say, oh, it feels selfish to dream for myself, Like I hear that one a lot within our community. And I'm like, oh, and I think, I think in those moments, I really help people connect with their inner child, like, when we look at our child, we never say like, oh, don't do that. I mean, some of us grew up hearing that, but I think our evolved selves wouldn't say like, don't do that. We say like, hey, why don't you just do something you enjoy doing and keep doing it and just keep doing it, right? And then it eventually turns into something. And I think that's kind of, I feel like it's a lot of reparenting and helping people like dream for themselves. And in that process of dreaming for themselves, it literally provides an avenue for people to actually dream for the world and not feel this like their own sense of identity attached to dreaming for the world. I don't know if you understand what I mean when I say that.
I understand every single part of it, and I love it because it's just, you're saying, put your own life mask on first, just like,
yes.
It's like when you feed yourself, then you can serve that purpose that you want to ultimately help make an impact on. So by serving yourself first, you can then serve the world versus this current model where people serve the world and don't serve themselves, and they are burnt out, no energy, lack direction, and can't even vision putting themselves that way. I love it.
Yes. And a lot of times, some of these people, they do amazing things in the world, but it's not sustainable. And then it comes at such a huge expense to them, which is so counterproductive to dreaming for the world, right? And a lot of times, some of their own personal stuff gets in the way of even like really impacting the world in even bigger ways, right? And so I think that's why we need to have this relationship with ourselves to know how to relate with the world too, because it's all going to transfer over to at some point, and everything's going to show and be exposed.
Absolutely. Hatty, thank you so much for taking the time to kind of journey through, the book, your story, and everything about kind of how this came to be, and definitely helping put how we approach our mental health and inner well-being into context. If anyone wants to reach out to you to learn more, how can they do that?
Yeah, they could just reach out by email or our Instagram handle, which is Indwell_CO. And our email is hello@indwell.co. We'd be happy to answer any questions and even just get feedback too about how we can better support people on this journey.
I love it. I love it. And if you want the guide, you can either get it from indwell.co. I also have it on my site. And like I said, out of the 15,000 plus self-help and mental health books published each year in the US, if you are looking for one, then this is it. And it's a beautiful, I personally have two, because I have the one I write in markup, and then I have the one that I let sit there, look pretty, and inspire me. So please take a look at it, grab it. If you have more questions on, trauma-informed practice and, doing better for your employees, reach out to Hatty or myself, or even, just reach out to us. We would love to hear from anyone in order to talk about just about any topic. So Hatty, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Practice Dirty. Please support this podcast by subscribing on iTunes or Spotify and leaving us a rating. If you're looking for the best self-guided mindfulness and discovery tools available for women over the age of 40, head over to mikaelarose.com. I'll see you next time.